Hello everyone, and welcome to our final Trailwit Cold episode of 2021. I'm your host Robin Warder, and if you grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries, you'll probably remember the thrill of tuning into an episode and hearing Robert Stack utter the word update while this music you just heard played in the background. Back on January the 1st, 2020, we dropped a special update episode of the Trailwit Cold in which I discussed all the cases I had covered on the podcast which have since been solved or had major developments take place. Well, I'm pleased to announce that over the past 2 years, even more cases have been solved or had major developments, so I'm now releasing a second update episode and will definitely have plenty of new material to discuss. But before we get started, I just wanted to mention that on this episode, I'll only be discussing updates to Trailwit Cold cases which have taken place since the end of 2019. If you want to hear more about the updates which have taken place before that, and you haven't listened to our original update episode, which is episode number 155, then I suggest you go back and check it out, as some of the updates we'll be talking about here are add-ons to the updates from that episode. Anyway, without any further ado, let us now begin the Trailwit Cold's second update episode. So I want to begin with a case which I already discussed on our previous update episode, but man, there have been a lot of new developments since then, and I'll be discussing what might be the most surreal experience I've ever had since I launched the Trailwit Cold nearly 6 years ago. On January the 25th, 2017, back when this podcast was still doing shorter minisodes, I covered the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl named Jonelle Matthews on minisode number 11. On the evening of December the 20th, 1984, Jonelle had sang in a choir at a Christmas concert in her hometown of Greeley, Colorado, before she was dropped off at home by her friend's father. At the time, Jonelle's mother was out of town, and her father and older sister were at a high school basketball game, but when they returned home later that night, Jonelle was not there, and the evidence clearly showed that she had been abducted. For the next 34 and a half years, Jonelle remained a missing person, and no one was ever publicly named as a suspect or a person of interest. However, on July the 23rd, 2019, a construction crew was excavating in a rural area about 15 miles from Jonelle's home in order to install an oil pipeline, but they wound up uncovering some skeletal remains. Within days, DNA testing positively identified the remains as belonging to Jonelle Matthews, and while her exact cause of death was not released at that time, it has since been revealed that she died from a gunshot wound to the head. Less than 2 months after the discovery of the remains, the Greeley Police Department announced that they had a 68-year-old person of interest named Steve Pankey. In 1984, Pankey and his family lived in Greeley, only 2 miles away from the Matthews residence, though it does not seem like he knew them personally. Pankey had since moved to Twin Falls, Idaho, and made 2 unsuccessful attempts to run for state governor, and while 2 Greeley detectives traveled there to interview him, he refused to answer any questions without an attorney. But the main reason Pankey popped up on the radar to begin with is because he had made repeated attempts to contact the authorities and insert himself into the investigation over the years. After he was publicly named as a person of interest, Pankey showed no hesitation about speaking to a number of different media outlets where he denied all involvement in the crime and maintained his innocence. In November of 2019, Pankey appeared as a guest on Unfound, a true crime podcast about missing persons cases hosted by Ed Densel. Pankey had reached out for an interview because he wanted to share his side of the story, and the full episode wound up being over 4 hours long. Well, nearly 2 years later, this interview wound up being played as evidence in open court when Pankey went on trial for murder. Yes, on October the 13th, 2020, Pankey was indicted on charges of first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping in the death of Jonelle Matthews, and he would be extradited from Idaho to Greeley to await trial. Now, the case against Pankey was very circumstantial, as there was no DNA or physical evidence to incriminate him, and even though he did own a firearm back in 1984, the actual murder weapon has never been found. If you read Pankey's indictment, it's clear that the decision to charge him with murder was based entirely on his own suspicious actions and incriminating statements he is alleged to have made. I mentioned earlier that Pankey made repeated attempts to insert himself into the investigation, as he told law enforcement he had information about the crime that he would only provide in exchange for immunity from prosecution. What really raised eyebrows is that Pankey supposedly provided details about Jonelle's abduction which had never been released publicly, particularly when he mentioned that someone had used a rake to cover up shoe impressions in the snow outside the Matthews residence. According to investigators, Pankey could not have known this piece of information unless he was personally involved in what happened. Pankey's ex-wife, Angela Hicks, would also inform law enforcement about a number of suspicious remarks he had made in connection to the case. She claimed that on the day after Jonelle went missing, her husband made a last-minute decision to take her and their 5-year-old son on a trip to California to spend Christmas with his parents, even though he had previously expressed no desire to do so. When Hicks expressed her concern about who would look after the family dogs while they were away, Pankey said the dogs were gone because he had dumped them somewhere, and she claimed she never saw the dogs again. The family returned to Greeley after Christmas, but Hicks claimed that Pankey developed an obsession with Jonelle's disappearance, as he kept checking the car radio for news about her on the drive home, and made her read newspaper articles about the case to him. When they arrived home, Hicks said that Pankey immediately started digging in the yard, and 2 days later, she saw a car on their property inexplicably burst into flames before Pankey disposed of it at a local salvage yard. Sometime over the next month, Pankey attended a church service in which the pastor made a statement that he had heard from God that Jonelle Matthews would be found safe. This prompted Pankey to become agitated and call the pastor a quote-unquote false prophet, and he had to be escorted out of the church. While Pankey was never publicly named as a person of interest until after Jonelle's remains were found in 2019, Hicks said that he would mention her case at odd times over the years. In 1999, when Hicks found out that Pankey had not paid that month's rent, he told her he was using the money for legal fees because police were, quote-unquote, persecuting him for sharing everything he knew about Jonelle Matthews. When Hicks expressed her confusion about Pankey mentioning that case out of nowhere after several years, Pankey allegedly replied, quote, "Do you really think I could have heard her when she looked so much like you?" 9 years later, their youngest son Carl was murdered by his estranged girlfriend, and Hicks claimed that on the day before his memorial service, Pankey went up to the urn containing Carl's ashes and got very emotional before he made this statement, quote, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonelle Matthews." Now, when I released my update episode 2 years ago, I stated that I really didn't know what to make of Pankey. I had watched some of his interviews, and he seemed to be completely all over the map, but while his obsession with this case came across very oddly, it did not appear at that time that there was any real evidence to link him to Jonelle's murder. Before Pankey's trial took place, this story would be featured on an episode of the true crime show 48 Hours, which featured an interview with his defense attorney, Anthony Viorst. He claimed that Pankey simply had an obsessive interest in Jonelle's case and true crime in general, and that he would make false statements in order to make himself the center of attention. At trial, the defense would argue that Pankey's behavior stemmed from obsessive-compulsive disorder and Asperger's syndrome, which compelled Pankey to repeatedly insert himself into the investigation, even though he had no actual involvement in the crime. Well, one fact here which is indisputable is that Pankey did have an interest in true crime, as he even mentioned that he was a fan of true crime podcasts during his interview on Unfound. However, shortly after Pankey's arrest, I would make a shocking discovery which revealed how deep his interests seemed to go. While going through my list of supporters on the Trail Went Cold's Patreon page, I did a double take when I noticed the name Steve Pankey. When I checked his account, I saw his profile picture and noticed that he had a post office box in Twin Falls, Idaho listed as his address, so this confirmed that he was most definitely the same Steve Pankey. He had originally signed up as a Patreon supporter in May of 2019, 2 months before Jonelle's remains were found, and since he had not yet been named as a person of interest, I had no idea who he was. It's standard practice for me to send stickers and a signed thank you card to everyone who signed up as a patron for my podcast, so I would have mailed those items to Pankey's P.O. box before I realized he had a personal connection to one of the cases I covered. Pankey's Patreon account also revealed that he had signed up as a supporter for some other true crime podcasts, including The Vanished, Already Gone, and Trace Evidence, and he was also a patron for YouTube true crime creator John Lorden. Him being a true crime podcast fan is not unusual on its own, but the key difference between The Trail Went Cold and those other podcasts is that I had covered the Jonelle Matthews case. Now, since my minisode was released back in January of 2017, when Jonelle was still a missing person, Pankey had never been publicly linked to the case, so I made no mention of him at all. But I had to wonder if this minisode is what caused Pankey to discover The Trail Went Cold to begin with. What's also crazy is that Panky had signed up for my highest Patreon tier, which meant he was sending me $10 per month for full access to all of our podcast bonus material. So while Panky may have originally been drawn to The Trail Went Cold because we covered the Jonelle Matthews case, I don't think he would have kept pledging money for a year and a half unless he legitimately enjoyed the show. When I made an announcement on Twitter about Panky being one of my Patreon supporters, it made a lot of waves in the true crime community, and I was invited to appear as a guest on the podcast Crawlspace to discuss the situation. Let's face it, this is something that true crime podcasters have always wondered in the back of their minds. Has an offender in one of the cases they've covered ever listened to their episode about it? The idea of a murderer using a podcast episode as a means to relive what they did is pretty unsettling, particularly if said crime is still unsolved and they are continuing to get away with it. The revelation about Panky seemed to be one of the first confirmed cases of this exact situation, but it must be stated that at the time of this episode's recording, Steve Panky is still technically not a convicted murderer in the eyes of the law, as this case is yet to reach a complete resolution. Panky's 5-week trial began in October of 2021 at the Weld County Courthouse in Greeley, and while his defense team acknowledged his bizarre behavior and his attempts to interfere with the investigation, they also argued that this did not prove Panky was a murderer, and there was virtually no evidence that he was actually responsible for the crime. In fact, during his closing statement to the jury, Anthony Viors flat out stated, quote, "Steve Panky is a jerk. It's a fact, we can't hide from it. I don't like to say bad things about my client, but I think it's important for the big picture here." End quote. The defense also attempted to point the finger at an alternate suspect named Norris Drake, as his mother lived directly across the street from the Matthews residence, and Drake had gone there to visit her on the night Jonelle went missing. Drake had reportedly exhibited behavior to suggest he had an inappropriate interest in young girls, and he did not return to his own residence until hours after Jonelle was believed to have been abducted. But since Drake died in 2007, he is no longer around to refute any of the allegations against him. In the end, the defense did plant enough reasonable doubt in some jurors' minds to avoid a conviction, as on November the 4th, after 2 days of deliberations, it was announced that the jury could not reach a verdict on the charges of first-degree murder, felony murder, and second-degree kidnapping, though they did find him guilty on an additional charge of false reporting, a misdemeanor which only carries a maximum sentence of 6 months. So in the end, a mistrial was declared on the murder and kidnapping charges, and we will probably not have a conclusive resolution in this case until sometime next year. Anthony Viorst has since stepped down as Panky's defense attorney, as he does not believe he has the time or energy to take this case to trial again. So Panky has been assigned a new public defender named John Walsh, no relation to John Walsh of America's Most Wanted fame, who will need several months to review the case and prepare for another trial. A status hearing for the case has been scheduled for May of 2022, and in the meantime, Panky will continue to remain incarcerated at the Weld County Jail. So needless to say, when I decided to cover the Jonelle Matthews case on The Trail Went Cold nearly 5 years ago, I could not have predicted the unexpected directions this case would take, and at this point, I really have no idea how this is going to end. Whatever you think about the evidence against Steve Panky, you do have to acknowledge that there isn't a smoking gun against him per se, so it's difficult to predict how a second trial is going to turn out. I really have to feel immense sympathy for the Matthews family, as this ordeal is going to continue to drag on for them, but after not knowing what happened to Jonelle for nearly 35 years, at least they were able to recover her remains and give her a proper burial. As for Steve Panky, well, he is technically still a Patreon supporter for this podcast, as it's not like he can just cancel his subscription while he's in jail. Well, regardless of his guilt or innocence, once I discovered that Panky was a patron following his arrest, I decided to donate all the money he sent me to a non-profit organization called Private Investigations for the Missing, which provides investigative services for loved ones and missing people. And since I've continued to receive money from Panky every month for the past year, I've always made sure to keep making donations to victims' advocacy organizations and other good causes on his behalf. So hopefully, by the time I release an update episode, we will finally have a definitive conclusion in this case. So before I talk about other cases from this podcast which have been solved, I wanted to briefly discuss some cases I referenced on my last update episode where a suspect had been arrested, but they have still not gone on trial. This may have something to do with the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic started only a few months after the episode's release, which has caused severe delays in the court system. In November of 2016, I released episode number 21 of this podcast, which covered the disappearance of 36-year-old Renee McRae and her 3-year-old son Andrew, who both vanished after leaving on a road trip from Inverness, Scotland on November the 12th, 1976. Long story short, the most promising suspect was a married man named Bill McDowell, as Renee had been carrying on a secret affair with him for years, and it turned out that Bill was Andrew's biological father. Even though Renee and Andrew's remains have still never been found, it was announced on September the 11th, 2019, that Bill McDowell, who was 77 years old by this point, had been arrested and charged with their murders, as well as 2 additional charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Bill was subsequently released on bail, but unfortunately, there really isn't all that much new to report, as COVID-19 has obviously caused delays. Even though Bill has entered a plea of not guilty to all the charges against him, his defense team argued that Bill's advanced age and poor health made him unfit to stand trial, as he has suffered from such medical ailments as cardiac issues, liver failure, and lymphoma. Bill also apparently has a habit of falling asleep at inopportune times, and this past September, he suffered a severe injury when he fell asleep while sitting on a wall at his home, causing him to fall off and damage a vertebrae in his neck. In spite of this, it was announced just a month and a half before this episode's release that Bill was deemed fit to stand trial, and it's currently scheduled to take place at the High Court in Inverness in September of 2022. We will definitely provide you with further updates on this case once the trial takes place. Another case from this podcast, which has been in a holding pattern for quite some time, is the disappearance of 28-year-old Danielle Stizlicki, which I covered in minisode number 22. On December the 2nd, 2016, Danny went missing after leaving her place of employment in Southfield, Michigan, but even though her remains have not been recovered, Floyd Galloway Jr., a security guard from her workplace, would be charged with premeditated first-degree murder in March of 2019. Galloway is currently serving a 16 to 35-year prison sentence for an unrelated incident in which he attempted to sexually assault another woman, and only 3 months before the release of my update episode, a preliminary hearing had taken place where a judge ruled that there was enough evidence for Galloway to stand trial for Danny's murder. Of course, there have been numerous delays these past 2 years, but at the time of this recording, the scheduled start date for Galloway's trial is March the 29th, 2022. So once again, I'll keep you apprised of any future developments. Also, I just wanted to make one more mention of the very first case from the trail went cold which wound up being solved, and that's the 2009 disappearance of 47-year-old Pamela Butler, which I covered nearly 5 years ago on minisode number 10. I've already gone into great detail about this case on our previous update episode, so I won't repeat myself here, but as you probably know, even though Pamela's remains have never been recovered, her former boyfriend, Jose Rodriguez Cruz, was charged with her murder. After admitting that he strangled Pamela to death and disposed of her body, Jose agreed to a plea deal in which he would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 12-year prison sentence. However, it would soon emerge that Jose's former wife, Marta Haiti Rodriguez, had also gone missing under suspicious circumstances in May of 1989, and once a new investigation was launched, DNA testing was performed on a set of unidentified skeletal remains for a Jane Doe who had been found along Interstate 95 near Arlington, Virginia in 1991. It turned out the remains belonged to Marta, and in October of 2019, just over 2 months before the release of the last update episode, Jose was indicted with first-degree murder as well as the unlawful concealment of Marta's body. Well, I'm pleased to announce that in November of 2020, Jose agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder for his role in Marta's death, and he would receive a 40-year prison sentence. I'm sure you'll agree that Jose's 12-year sentence for murdering Pam was far too lenient, but this additional sentence for Marta's murder now ensures that he will never get out of prison. In my last update episode, I also discussed a recent development in the unsolved disappearance of 17-year-old Tracy Crow, who vanished from Dauphin County, Pennsylvania on August the 5th, 1989, and was covered on episode number 89 of the podcast. In August of 2019, around the 30-year anniversary of Tracy's disappearance, a person of interest named Matthew Webster was charged with perjury in connection with this case. Webster had allegedly gotten drunk and confessed to a female acquaintance named Holly Mallet that he and some friends of his were responsible for Tracy's abduction and murder, stating, quote, "It was just supposed to be a rape and done, but then it turned out to be a lot more than that," end quote. While testifying under oath in front of a grand jury, Webster made some statements which were proven false by recorded evidence, so he was arrested for perjury, and there was hope that Webster's legal problems might compel him to reveal more information about Tracy's disappearance. Well, unfortunately, this development wound up going nowhere, as on December the 31st, 2019, the day before my update episode was released, Webster decided to plead no contest to the perjury charge and received a sentence of 4.5 to 12 months in prison. Since he had already been in jail for 4.5 months by that point, Webster was given credit for time served and released on parole. Believe it or not, immediately following Webster's release, Holly Mallett, the person whom he allegedly confessed to, was also charged with perjury, and after pleading guilty in September of 2020, Mallett received a sentence of 6 to 23 months in prison. So it's still unclear if there was any truth to Webster's statements about Tracy's murder and if he was involved in her disappearance, but there have not been any further developments in the case, and she remains a missing person. Now we're going to talk about some cases which have been solved these past 2 years through those wonderful processes known as DNA profiling and genetic genealogy. And one of them is a case which has haunted me since I saw it on Unsolved Mysteries 30 years ago, and that's the Orange Sock murders, which I covered on the podcast in May of 2017 in episode number 33. The two victims in this case were 29-year-old Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer and 21-year-old Annette Schnee, who were both murdered after being picked up hitchhiking in the town of Breckenridge, Colorado on January the 6th, 1982. This was a time period when hitchhiking was just a common way of life in the area, as both these women would frequently use it as a means of everyday travel, but what was particularly chilling about this story is that Bobbie and Annette were both shot to death by the same perpetrator on the same night at different times and different remote locations. Bobbie's body was found the day after she was murdered, and there was an orange booty sock at the scene which did not belong to her, but 6 months later, Annette's body was found 13 miles away, and since she was wearing the matching orange sock, this proved that both women were killed by the same person. One of Bobbie's gloves had traces of blood on it, and there was also a bloody tissue found at the murder scene, but investigators mistakenly assumed that the blood belonged to her. However, sometime during the early 1990s, DNA testing showed that the blood had a male profile, as Bobbie likely fought back against her attacker and drew blood by punching his nose. Even though Bobbie's husband, Jeff Oberholtzer, was considered to be a possible suspect for years, the DNA from the blood did not match him, and Jeff was finally cleared. When the DNA was entered into a national database of offenders, it turned up no matches, but in 2018, genetic genealogy started to become the go-to method for solving cold cases, many of which were years, if not decades old. Now, since DNA testing was not a thing back in 1982, I'm sure the perpetrator in this case did not think it was a big deal to leave that bloody tissue behind at the scene, so I wondered if he was starting to sweat with fear that this evidence was eventually going to come back to bite him. Well, that turned out to be exactly what happened, as on February the 24th, 2021, 70-year-old Alan Lee Phillips was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree kidnapping, and 1 count of first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. Even though a number of convicted criminals have been looked at as possible suspects in this crime, this was the first time Phillips had ever popped up on the radar. He is not believed to have had any connection to either of the victims, and may have targeted them at random when he picked them up hitchhiking. If the killer's DNA had not been entered into a genealogical database and linked back to him, it's possible that Phillips never would have been found. At the time of his arrest, Phillips was living in Dumont, Colorado, and after the investigation led to him, he was put under surveillance. A sample of his DNA was obtained by collecting a paper napkin he threw away at a post office, and it turned out to be a match to the blood from the Orange Sock murders. And here's a remarkable side story about this crime. The murders occurred in minus 20-degree temperatures on a very cold and snowy night, and Phillips wound up getting his pickup truck trapped in a snowdrift on a remote road on top of the mountainous Guanella Pass because he did not have the proper chains on his tires. He had to use his headlights to send out a distress signal, which caught the attention of a plane flying overhead, so the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office dispatched 2 vehicles to the area to rescue Phillips. Believe it or not, this story actually made the newspapers at the time, and one article I found featured this quote from Phillips, quote, "You find out how lonely it is really quick. I thought about walking to a ski pass nearby and went about 200 yards and thought, no way, it was too cold," end quote. One of the rescue workers had asked Phillips why he was reckless enough to take such a dangerous remote road in bad weather, but considering that this location was in fairly close proximity to the location where Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was found, we might know the answer to that question. Eerily enough, the rescue workers did notice that Phillips appeared to have some scratches on his face, but he claimed he had received them after he tripped in the snow. However, Phillips had not been rescued and froze to death after murdering 2 women, then I suppose you could have considered that to be the ultimate form of karma. Anyway, back in September, a preliminary hearing was held in which a judge ordered Phillips to stand trial for the 2 murders. At the time of this recording, a trial date has not been set, but we'll definitely keep you updated. So now we're going to talk about another unsolved mysteries case from Colorado, where an arrest was made possible because the perpetrator left a key piece of evidence at the scene, and that's the murder of Roger Dean, which I covered in June of 2019 on episode number 128. Roger was a 51-year-old businessman who lived in a suburban neighborhood in Littleton with his wife DJ, but on the morning of November the 21st, 1985, a masked man entered their home and ordered Roger to tie up his wife and blindfold her with duct tape. DJ would later claim she heard the gunman say that Roger owed him money, and he wanted Roger to take him to the bank to withdraw $30,000 from an account. But it sounds like Roger attempted to run out of the house before the gunman shot him 6 times and fled the scene. There was speculation that Roger's death might have been some sort of botched attempt to stage his own kidnapping, as he had $32,000 tucked away in a private bank account which his wife did not know about. Nearly 5 years later, DJ would get an anonymous letter and a series of phone calls from a man claiming to be Roger's killer, who demanded that DJ pay him $100,000 or else he would murder her daughter. Even though DJ contacted the FBI and made a money drop, the caller never showed up to collect it, and he stopped making contact with DJ. When the killer fled Roger's murder scene, he had taken his ski mask off and left it behind at the house. The mask contained samples of the killer's hair, and while this wouldn't have been a viable option back in 1985, investigators eventually obtained a DNA profile from the hair. Once again, after genetic genealogy became a tool in cold case investigations, I wondered if this was going to be the perpetrator's downfall, and if he was kicking himself for leaving this key piece of evidence behind. Well, on April the 9th, 2021, just a month and a half after the Orange Sock murders were solved, it was announced that 64-year-old Michael Jefferson had been indicted on the charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping for his role in Roger Dean's death. Much like with Alan Lee Phillips, there was no indication that Jefferson had ever popped up on the radar as a potential suspect until the perpetrator's DNA was entered into a genealogical database and eventually wound up being linked back to him. While Jefferson was living in New Orleans by this point, he had lived in Colorado back in 1985 and had a past criminal record, so investigators put him under surveillance. When Jefferson boarded a flight to Los Angeles to go visit his family, he was followed by 2 deputies who managed to obtain Jefferson's DNA by collecting a water bottle he had discarded during the flight. It wasn't long before a match was made to the DNA from the hair samples on the killer's mask, leading to Jefferson's arrest for Roger's murder and his extradition to Colorado to face the charges. Sadly, DJ Dean passed away in August of 2020 and did not live long enough to see her husband's killer brought to justice. Now, I have to admit that I was taken by surprise a bit when I saw that Michael Jefferson was black, because Unsolved Mysteries described the killer as being a white male, and they even got a white actor to play the masked man during the reenactments. However, on the morning of the murder, a girl who lived in the neighborhood told police she had been looking out her bedroom window and saw a black man running away from the Dean residence and climbing into a parked car before he drove away. Investigators attempted to reenact the situation by having someone look down at a white police officer from the girl's window, and they claimed that from this perspective, the officer looked dark-skinned while walking past some bright white snow. They figured the girl was mistaken, but it looks like she may have been correct all along. Of course, at this point, there's still a number of unanswered questions. It's still unclear if Roger knew Jefferson, or if he arranged for him to show up at his residence for some sort of staged kidnapping which went horribly wrong. We also don't know if Jefferson was the caller who attempted to extort $100,000 from DJ in 1990, or if this was just another individual who had no involvement in Roger's murder, but attempted to exploit the situation to make some money. But even if Jefferson was the extortionist, he will not face additional charges for that offense, since the statute of limitations have expired. there haven't been any new details released about this case since April, and as of now, no trial date has been set for Jefferson, but as always, we'll keep you apprised of any further developments. While we're on the subject of genetic genealogy, one of its greatest benefits is that it can help conclusively solve cold cases in which the killer is already dead, as we've seen it link DNA to deceased suspects. As an example, on my last update episode, I discussed the 2007 murder of Jodine Sarin, when genetic genealogy led to a suspect named David Mabrito, who had killed himself years earlier. But since the odds of the DNA from the crime scene belonging to anyone else besides Mabrito were 1 in 64 quintillion, that pretty much meant the books on that case could be closed. We've also seen a few recent examples of cold cases where the DNA was linked to a suspect, but they decided to kill themselves before they could be arrested, as I'm sure they knew their days were numbered. This exact situation occurred in the murder of Jessica Bagan, which I covered on episode number 107 of the podcast in January of 2019. Jessica lived in Sitka, Alaska, and had just finished celebrating her 17th birthday at her sister's house when she decided to walk home during the early morning hours of May the 4th, 1996. Sadly, her body would later be found in a wooded area next to a bicycle path as she was sexually assaulted and asphyxiated to death. 11 days later, a man named Richard Bingham flat out walked into the police station and said that he believed he might have been responsible for Jessica Bagan's murder, but could not clearly remember the crime because of an alcoholic blackout. After being interrogated by the police, Bingham eventually made a videotaped confession and was charged with Jessica's rape and murder. However, Bingham would enter a not guilty plea, as it turned out that none of the DNA or physical evidence from the murder scene matched him. When Bingham went on trial for the crime 1 year later, the only real evidence against him was his questionable confession, which appeared to be coerced, so after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Bingham not guilty on all charges. In spite of this, Bingham continued to live under a cloud of suspicion from people who still believed he was the killer, and it would be 23 years before he got his name cleared once and for all. On August the 11th, 2020, the Alaska Department of Public Safety announced that Jessica Bagan's murder had been solved, and the perpetrator was a 66-year-old Arkansas resident named Steve Branch. I'm guessing that some of you might have done a double take when you heard that, because Steve Branch also happens to be the name of one of the murdered boys in the infamous West Memphis 3 case from Arkansas, but there's no connection between them. This Steve Branch had been living in Sitka, Alaska in 1996, and had actually been accused of raping an 18-year-old girl in March of that year. However, Branch was not actually arrested for felony sexual assault until 1 month after Jessica's murder, but by that point, Richard Bingham had already been charged with that crime, so Branch was not investigated as a suspect. Like Bingham, Branch wound up being acquitted when he went on trial for the sexual assault, as he maintained that the encounter was consensual, and he moved away to the small town of Austin, Arkansas several years later. But when DNA evidence from the murder was uploaded to a genealogical database, it wound up pointing the investigation towards Branch. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation attempted to coordinate with Arkansas law enforcement to collect a discarded DNA sample from Branch, the same strategy which was used to implicate Alan Lee Phillips and Michael Jefferson. But since this never came to fruition, Alaskan investigators decided to travel to Branch's residence in Austin to question him. When Branch refused to provide a sample of his own DNA, the investigators left to obtain a warrant, but shortly thereafter, he took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Branch's DNA was then posthumously matched to the DNA from the murder scene, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the perpetrator. So while it's bittersweet that Branch will never face justice for murdering Jessica Bagan, at least this case can now officially be classified as solved. And incidentally, shortly after these events made the news, I actually got a nice email from Galen Payne, who had been Richard Bagan's defense attorney at his trial. She had found my Trail Went Cold episode and listened to it, and said I got the facts of the case, quote-unquote, impressively correct. So now we're going to talk about one more case in which there has been an arrest, though this was not brought about by DNA evidence because the victim is still technically a missing person. In August of 2020, I released episode number 189 of the podcast, which covered the disappearance of 21-year-old Bethany Decker, who lived in Loudoun County, Virginia, and was around 3 to 5 months pregnant at the time she went missing. Bethany was last confirmed to be alive on January the 29th, 2011, and even though she was married to her husband, Emil Decker, and they had an infant son together, Emil was an Army National Guardsman who was often deployed to Afghanistan for long periods of time. During his absence, Bethany became involved in an affair with a Bolivian immigrant named Ronald Roldan, who was believed to be the father of her unborn child, though this was never conclusively proven. Unfortunately, Ronald was known for being abusive and controlling towards Bethany, and while he did a number of suspicious things following her disappearance and seemed like the most promising suspect, there was no evidence that a crime had even been committed. However, in November of 2014, Ronald was arrested in Pinehurst, North Carolina for a violent attack on his estranged girlfriend, Vicki Willoughby, in which he shot her 3 times and caused Vicki to lose her right eye. Ronald should have probably gone to prison for attempted murder, but due to some issues with the search warrant, a lot of the evidence collected against Ronald was ruled to be inadmissible, so the attempted murder charge against him had to be dropped. Ronald ultimately agreed to plead guilty to the lesser charges of felony assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, and felony assault inflicting serious bodily injury, and he wound up receiving a sentence of 6 to 8 years in prison. Given the brutal nature of the crime, that did seem to be rather light, but when Ronald's sentence was completed, he would immediately be handed over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation back to his native Bolivia. However, on November the 9th, 2020, one day before Ronald's projected release date, the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office would obtain an arrest warrant for Ronald and announce they were charging him with abduction by force or intimidation in connection with Bethany's disappearance. He was subsequently extradited from North Carolina to Loudoun County, and 1 month later, Ronald would be indicted on the additional charge of second-degree murder. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Bethany's remains have still never been found, so at this particular point in time, it hasn't been revealed what new, if any, evidence might have surfaced to compel investigators to charge Ronald with Bethany's murder after all this time. But I can certainly understand their strategy here. If Ronald had been deported back to Bolivia following the completion of his previous sentence, it might have been very difficult to track him down again. Filing these new charges against Ronald will at least ensure that he remains incarcerated in the United States while they continue building a case against him. Anyway, the projected start date for Ronald's trial is February the 14th, 2022, and I'll certainly keep you updated about what happens. Well, I've talked about the major role that genetic genealogy has played in solving murders, but it has turned out to be an absolute godsend when it comes to unidentified decedents. Many of these identifications have been made possible by the formation of a volunteer non-profit organization called the DNA Doe Project, which launched in 2017 and has since used forensic genealogy to help over 50 decedents get their names back. After the release of this episode, that number will only continue to grow, and it seems like we're hearing news about the identifications of a John or Jane Doe virtually every other day now. One of the more famous cases that the DNA Doe Project took on was the Sumter County Does, an unidentified male and female who were both shot to death on a secluded dirt road in Sumter County, South Carolina on August the 9th, 1976. I covered this story on episode number 129 of the podcast, which came out in June of 2019, and when I learned that the DNA Doe Project would be working on the case, I was pretty ecstatic, given their enormous success rate. Sure enough, on January the 21st, 2021, a press conference was held by the Sumter County Sheriff's Office, who announced that the 2 victims had been identified as 29-year-old James Paul Freund and 24-year-old Pamela Mae Buckley. One of the most promising clues in this case had been a ring that the male victim was wearing, which had the initials JPF inscribed on them, and of course, this turned out to be a perfect match to James Paul Freund. Now, over the years, there were a number of different theories about who these victims might have been. At one point, it was theorized that they were brother and sister until DNA testing showed no genetic connection between them. There was also speculation that they might have traveled to the United States from another country, which is why no one ever came forward to claim them. The male was often referred to as Jacques Doe because of the eyewitness account from a campground owner who was certain he had interacted with the couple on multiple occasions. He claimed that the young man had told him that his name was Jacques and that he hailed from a prominent family in Canada where his family was a doctor. Well, James Freund was born in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and lived most of his life in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so if this campground owner's story was true, he either must have interacted with a completely different couple, or James totally lied to him. James was an only child who had lost his father in 1966, and his mother passed away in 2004 before he could be identified. I've seen a number of posts on Reddit and the Web Sleuths forum from people who have managed to dig up additional information on the backgrounds of both victims from public records and newspaper articles. It turns out that James got married to a woman named Sherilyn Albright in 1965, and the couple had one child together before they filed for divorce 6 years later. While details are sketchy, it sounds like James had a second child with another woman at some point, and he was charged with, quote-unquote, non-support of a child born out of wedlock in 1974. As for Pamela Buckley, she was originally born in Redwood County, Minnesota, and had 2 brothers and 2 sisters before she later moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado. By the time Pamela was identified, both her parents were deceased, and in a tragic twist of fate, one of her sisters, Laura Buckley Comerford, would pass away only 8 days after the press conference about Pamela's identification, and Laura's obituary even states that she was preceded in death by her sister Pam. During the early 1970s, Pamela had been part of a folk band called Sunlending, which toured around the West Coast and the Midwest. She also got married to a man named Gary Clifford Kennel in 1972, but they eventually separated, and their divorce was not actually finalized until 11 days after Pamela was murdered. It seems like the last time anyone from James or Pamela's families heard from them was in December of 1975, and while they were each reported missing, it sounds like the investigations never went anywhere. Since they lived in different states, and there's no indication that they knew each other, it seems likely that James and Pamela crossed paths somewhere while traveling throughout the United States before they started traveling together. Of course, the big unresolved mystery in this case is how these 2 young people wound up being murdered on that remote road in Sumter County and the identity of their killer. The actual murder weapon will later be found in the possession of a truck driver named Lonnie George Henry, as ballistics tests showed that it was the same gun used to shoot James and Pamela. Even though the serial numbers had been filed off, and Henry kept changing his story about how he obtained the gun, he denied any involvement in the murders, and the authorities believed there was insufficient evidence to file charges. Henry died in 1982, but the Sumter County Sheriff's Office have announced that they reopened the investigation into the murders, so if Henry was the killer, hopefully they can uncover conclusive evidence to implicate him or whoever the real perpetrator was. I think there's a good chance that James and Pamela were murdered by someone who picked them up hitchhiking together, but at this point we can only speculate. One other thing worth mentioning is that I once featured the Sumter County Does in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Mysterious Cases Involving Unidentified People, which was originally published on June the 14th, 2013. And well, I never could have predicted that 8.5 years later, forensic technology would advance so much that 8 out of the 10 decedents featured on that list have been identified. One of the 2 who hasn't is a young murder victim known as Little Miss Panisofsky, who was found in another Sumter County, this one in Florida, in February of 1971, and I covered her case on the same episode as the Sumter County Does. The other decedent from that list who is yet to be conclusively identified is the El Dorado Jane Doe, whom I covered on episode number 6 of The Trail Went Cold, and I previously discussed new developments in her case on my last update episode. Long story short, in January of 2019, it was announced that genetic genealogy had linked the El Dorado Jane Doe to a woman from Alabama, and the prevalent theory is that a male member of this woman's family may have fathered an illegitimate child, and he is the decedent's biological father. This would go a long way in explaining why it's been such a challenge to figure out the El Dorado Jane Doe's true identity, but unfortunately, nothing new has been reported about this development at all during the past 3 years, so I think you can still officially classify her as unidentified. So in October of 2018, I released episode number 93 of the podcast, which covered the stories of 2 young females who had been found murdered in Texas 1 year apart and could not be identified. One of the victims was found in Williamson County on October the 31st, 1979, and she would be nicknamed Orange Socks because that was the only garment of clothing she had on her body. The other victim was found murdered in Walker County on November the 1st, 1980, and became known as the Walker County Jane Doe. Well, if you heard my last update episode, you'll know that in August of 2019, after the DNA Doe Project managed to track down one of her biological relatives, Orange Socks finally got her identity back as she was positively identified as 23-year-old Deborah Jackson. And incidentally, I find it satisfying that I've covered 2 separate cases on the podcast involving Orange Socks, and they both found resolution. After this success story, I was hoping that the Walker County Jane Doe might eventually get her identity back someday, And sure enough, on November the 9th, 2021, it was officially announced that genetic genealogy and DNA testing have positively identified the victim as 14-year-old Sherry Jarvis. The Walker County Sheriff's Office had decided to partner with Othram Incorporated, who specialize in using forensic genealogy to solve cold cases, and over the past 3 years, they've helped solve a number of murders and identify no less than 30 John and Jane Does. This particular identification was nothing short of a miracle, as the Walker County Jane Doe's remains had decayed so much that there was virtually no usable genetic material, but DNA was extracted from a piece of brain tissue which had been preserved, and it eventually led to living relatives of Sherry Jarvis. Now, to recap the details of this case, multiple witnesses have reported interacting with Sherry in Walker County on Halloween night in 1980. She had stopped at a gas station and a truck stop to ask for directions to the nearby Ellis prison unit, as she said she was planning to see a friend there. Well, Sherry obviously never made it, as her nude body was discovered next to Interstate Highway 45 the following morning, as she had been beaten, sexually assaulted with a blunt instrument, and strangled to death with a ligature, possibly a pair of pantyhose. Sherry's photograph was later circulated among the inmates at the Ellis prison unit, but none of them admitted to recognizing her. Also, when Sherry was at the truck stop, she told one of the waitresses that she was 19 years old, but the waitress thought she looked much younger, which turned out to be correct, since Sherry was only 14 at the time. Sherry also said she hailed from the Aransas Pass, Rockport area of Texas, and when the waitress asked if her parents knew where she was, she replied, "Who cares?" In actuality, Sherry hailed from Stillwater, Minnesota, but in March of 1980, she was removed from her home and placed in the state's custody on charges of habitual truancy. She was placed in a state-licensed juvenile shelter, but shortly after her 14th birthday, after being transported to a local courthouse to appear at a detention hearing, Sherry ran away. Sherry was accompanied by a pair of sisters from the area, and they managed to make it to Green Bay, Wisconsin, but while the two sisters decided to return home, Sherry refused to do so. Her exact movements during the 7-month period prior to her murder are still unclear, but in August, Sherry mailed a letter to her mother postmarked from Denver, Colorado, in which she expressed her frustrations about being placed in the state's custody, but assured her family she would contact them again sometime between her 18th and 21st birthdays. But unfortunately, this turned out to be the last time Sherry's family ever heard from her, and while she was reported missing, and the Jarvises hired a private investigator to search for Sherry, she could not be located. It would be over 40 years before Sherry's family learned that she was murdered in Walker County, Texas, and sadly, by that point, both of her parents had passed away. Obviously, there are still some missing pieces to the puzzle here, as we still don't know who killed Sherry or why she was planning to see someone at the Ellis prison unit. But now that investigators finally know her true identity, this opens up a number of additional possibilities for solving her murder. So now I'm going to talk about a case which I covered back in minisode number 25, which has not been solved, but wound up going in a very unexpected direction earlier this year. If you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you're probably very familiar with the disappearance of 20-year-old Angela Hammond, which is undoubtedly one of the most terrifying stories ever featured on the show. On the evening of April the 4th, 1991, Angela was talking to her fiancé, Rob Schaefer, on a payphone in the town of Clinton, Missouri, and told him that she saw a dirty-looking bearded man in a pickup truck parked nearby. Shortly thereafter, Rob heard Angela scream into the phone while this man abducted her, so Rob instantly ran out of his home and drove into town, where he soon passed by a pickup truck being driven by an unidentified man. Rob could hear Angela yelling out his name from the truck's cab, so Rob pursued after it, but unfortunately, his car's transmission gave out, and the truck managed to escape town, and Angela was never heard from again. For years, I always assumed that Angela was the victim of an opportunistic random predator who just happened to be passing through the area, but this past April, around the 30th anniversary of Angela's disappearance, the Clinton Police Department made a surprising announcement that they were now exploring the possibility of Angela being the victim of mistaken identity. The new theory they presented involved a confidential informant whose testimony had once helped bring down a narcotics operation in the Lake of the Ozarks region. This informant's identity has been withheld from the public, but 30 years ago, he received an anonymous note in which the sentences were assembled by letters that had been cut out and pasted from magazines. The note started out by saying hello, followed by a number which had been assigned to the informant by the court in order to protect his identity. The next sentence read, quote, "We know who you are," followed again by the informant's court-issued number. It then read, quote, "People like you deserve what you get. We know where your foxy daughter is at." The note then mentioned the name of the informant's estranged wife and read, quote, "She will see us soon. Tell her she has our deepest sympathy in her further loss. Goodbye," end quote. The letter was postmarked April the 4th, 1991, the same date as Angela Hammond's abduction, and at the time, the informant's wife and daughter were living in Clinton. Well, the daughter's name also happened to be Angela, and after interviewing several people, investigators started to wonder if the bearded man with the pickup truck might have been connected to the narcotics operation the informant helped bring down. The responsible parties may have intended to target the informant's daughter, Angela, but wound up abducting Angela Hammond by mistake, as both Angelas apparently had a physical resemblance to one another. The Clinton PD also mentioned that they had recently received an anonymous voicemail at their precinct from someone who may have had information about the abduction and mentioned specific details involving the letter. The caller also mentioned two names, including an individual the police had previously investigated, but since they did not provide a means for the authorities to contact them, a public plea was sent out for the caller to get in touch again. As incredible as this scenario may sound, investigators stated that they have come across information which lends credibility to their theory, though they've been tight-lipped about specific details. While I haven't heard of any new developments in the investigation since April, and I remain cautiously skeptical, since I still believe that Angela's abduction resembles a crime of opportunity from a random stranger. But even if this mistaken identity theory turns out to be false, at least it has helped bring this case back into the spotlight. If this new angle does lead to a resolution, then maybe we will soon finally get to close the books on one of the most terrifying unsolved abductions of all time. Anyway, I'm pleased to announce that in addition to a number of the cases on this podcast being solved, one of them has also featured a wrongful conviction get overturned and an innocent man has been released from prison. In July of 2018, I decided to do something a little different from the norm for episode number 79 by covering a case which was officially considered to be solved, but there were many questions about the outcome. On March the 11th, 1985, a Bible study class was being held at the Rising Daughters Baptist Church in Waverly, Georgia, by the church's 66-year-old deacon, Harold Swain. His 63-year-old wife, Thelma Swain, was also present, and Harold was known for being the unofficial spokesperson for the local black community. An unidentified man showed up in the church's vestibule and told one of the parishioners that he wanted to speak with Harold, but when Harold went to meet the man, he was fatally gunned down. When Thelma ran into the vestibule to see what was going on, the man shot her too. The case was featured on one of the earliest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, and if you were to watch the segment today on Amazon Prime or YouTube, you'll see a brief text update which mentions that a suspect named Dennis Perry was convicted of both murders in 2003 and received 2 consecutive life sentences. But during my research into this case, I learned that there was quite a bit of doubt about Perry's conviction, as many key pieces of evidence from the case had gone missing over the years, and there was a lot of sketchy, questionable behavior from investigators and prosecutors. The killer had left a pair of eyeglasses behind at the scene, and even though the glasses themselves somehow got lost, 2 hairs which were found in the hinges wound up being preserved, and DNA testing showed that they did not match Dennis Perry, who also had perfect 20/20 vision and maintained that he never wore glasses to begin with. So I decided to take a deeper look into the case and cover it on The Trail Went Cold, but at the time, I had no idea that the true crime podcast Undisclosed was about to do their own deep dive into the story. Hosted by Rabia Chowdhury, Colin Miller, and Susan Simpson, Undisclosed has explored nearly 24 cases involving questionable and possibly wrongful convictions, and only a few weeks after I dropped my Trail Went Cold episode, I was surprised to learn that they were devoting an entire season to Dennis Perry, who was being represented by the Georgia Innocence Project. Each episode of Undisclosed is followed up by an addendum episode in which the hosts have a discussion about the information revealed on the episode, and Colin and Susan were kind enough to invite me to participate in an addendum episode titled Trail Still Cold, in which we talked about the case. And of course, it was a nerve-wracking experience, since they are both brilliant legal minds, and I am not, but they were both very nice, and the episode turned out well. If you watch the original Unsolved Mysteries episode, they spend a good portion of the segment focusing on an alternate suspect named Donnie Barentine, who had allegedly bragged about committing the murders, but the DNA testing on the hairs did not match him either. In addition to the undisclosed season about the case, a thorough investigation was performed by journalist Joshua Sharp of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who would go on to win a Livingston Award for his work and helped uncover another potential suspect, 56-year-old Eric Sparr. During the early stages of the investigation, Sparr was looked at as a suspect, as he was an alleged white supremacist with a history of racist comments who had allegedly bragged to multiple people about having murdered the Swains. In fact, the family of his first ex-wife even provided a tape recording of Sparr bragging about the crime to investigators, and his ex-wife expressed her belief that the glasses found at the murder scene belonged to him. However, Sparr would be dismissed as a suspect, as he seemed to have an alibi placing him at work at a grocery store on the night of the murders. However, there's a reason why Joshua Sharp published a series of articles about this case titled The Imperfect Alibi. You see, one of the original investigators had spoken over the phone with a man named Donald Mobley, who claimed to be Sparr's boss at the grocery store, and he confirmed Sparr's alibi and verified that he was working that night. The problem is that the investigator never actually spoke with Mobley face-to-face, and many years later, Joshua Sharp would discover that the name of Sparr's manager at that time was David Mobley, not Donald Mobley. Sharp soon managed to track down the real David Mobley, who claimed he had no memory of ever speaking to any investigators about the case. So while this has never been conclusively proven, it's certainly possible that Sparr could have impersonated Mobley over the phone in order to, quote-unquote, verify his own alibi. Needless to say, this new revelation put Sparr back on the radar as a potential suspect. A Georgia Innocence Project investigator approached Sparr's mother, Gladys Sparr, and she agreed to provide some hair samples which could be used for mitochondrial DNA testing. Well, in March of 2020, it was announced that when Gladys Sparr's DNA had been compared to the DNA from the hairs found on the hinges of the killer's glasses, they turned out to be a match. Armed with this new evidence, the Georgia Innocence Project and the law firm King & Spalding filed an extraordinary motion for a new trial for Dennis Perry, and a Brunswick Judicial Circuit Superior Court judge overturned his conviction and granted him a new trial. On July the 23rd, after being incarcerated for 2 decades, Perry was finally released from prison, and 1 year later, Brunswick Judicial Circuit District Attorney Keith Higgins filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Perry, which means he will no longer have to worry about going on trial for the crime again, and he's officially been exonerated. As a side note, while District Attorney Higgins agreed to drop the charges against Perry, his predecessor, Jackie Johnson, had put up a lot of resistance to overturning Perry's conviction and granting him a new trial until she lost her bid for re-election later that year. While Jackie Johnson has since attained a lot of additional notoriety for her reluctance to arrest the perpetrators in the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020, and just over 3 months before the release of this episode, Johnson was indicted on charges of violating her oath as a public officer and obstructing a police officer. As for Eric Sparr, he has not yet been charged with anything in relation to the Swain murders. Believe it or not, only a few days after Perry's conviction was overturned, his mother, Gladys Sparr, was found dead at her home. Now, given that she willingly handed over samples of her hair for DNA testing, it's easy to assume the worst, but it must be said that Gladys was 79 years old at the time, and her cause of death has never been released, so this doesn't necessarily mean that foul play took place. Eric Sparr has always maintained his innocence, and remember, since this was mitochondrial DNA testing, the results only show that the hairs belong to someone related to Gladys Sparr, and Eric does have a brother, so this might explain why this new evidence hasn't led to an arrest. But if Eric Sparr did commit these murders, I hope he is brought to justice at some point. So now we'll close things off by talking about the latest developments in another case involving a controversial conviction, and that's Tommy Ziegler, which, as I'm sure many of you already know, is my personal passion case. To recap, on Christmas Eve in 1975, 4 people were found murdered inside the W.T. Ziegler furniture store in Winter Garden, Florida. Tommy's wife, Eunice Ziegler, her parents, Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a regular customer named Charlie Mays. Tommy was later charged, convicted, and sentenced to death for all 4 murders, but because of the controversial nature of this case, his execution has never taken place, and he is still on death row 46 years later and is currently 76 years old. Well, on my last update episode, I mentioned that the 9th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office had formed a conviction integrity unit, and they were planning to review Ziegler's case and determine whether or not he would be eligible for additional DNA testing, which had been denied to him by the state no less than 6 times over the past 2 decades. Well, the director of the Conviction Integrity Unit, Monique Worrell, expressed her belief that Ziegler received a quote-unquote less than fair trial and recommended the new testing. She was soon replaced as director, and the state attorney's office overruled Worrell's decision and rejected the request. However, there was still a light at the end of the tunnel for Ziegler's supporters, as Monique Worrell herself was elected state attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit in November of 2020, and 7 months later, Worrell finally announced that she would authorize the new DNA testing as she wanted to, quote-unquote, ensure that there is no miscarriage of justice. But once again, there would be interference, as Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody decided to step in and ask the courts to block the hearing, arguing that it does not comply with Florida's procedural rules. On October the 15th, 2021, Florida Circuit Judge Wayne C. Wooten issued a ruling in a case involving another Florida death row inmate named Henry Cerecci, whom, like Ziegler, has spent the past 4 decades incarcerated for murder and has always maintained his innocence. Monique Worrell had also made an agreement with Cerecci's defense team to grant new DNA testing in his case until the Florida Attorney General's office intervened and attempted to stop it, but Judge Wooten ruled that the Attorney General had no legal standing to do this. Technically, this ruling could have set a precedent to allow the DNA testing in the Ziegler case, but the Attorney General's office has appealed Judge Wooten's decision to the Florida Supreme Court. So once again, Tommy's attempts at exoneration will remain in a holding pattern due to bureaucratic red tape, since it's unlikely the testing will occur until the Florida Supreme Court makes their own ruling. Of course, Tommy Ziegler and Henry Cerecci supporters have expressed their dismay that this is nothing more than a stalling tactic from the state of Florida, who are probably hoping that both men might die of natural causes before their innocence can be proven. During the summer of 2020, Ziegler was actually on death's door, as he became seriously ill after contracting COVID-19 on death row and had to be transported to a hospital in Jacksonville. Tommy was struggling to breathe so badly that he had to spend 2 weeks on oxygen, but in spite of his advanced age, he made a miraculous recovery, and Tommy's supporters have taken this as a sign that perhaps he will eventually walk out of prison someday. But for now, we'll have to see how all this legal wrangling with the DNA testing goes, as the saga of the Winter Garden furniture store murders just will not come to an end. Anyway, that about brings an end to the Trail Went Cold special update episode, and if you would like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. I just released a bonus episode about the death of a man named Joseph Mulvaney, a murder victim whose skeleton was discovered inside a Foot Locker 3 decades after he was killed, and if you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you're probably familiar with the segment about this story, which is often referred to as Gabby's Bones. And incidentally, if you enjoyed this update episode, I've released 2 episodes over the past few years on Patreon titled The Trail Went Hot, which talk about a number of cold cases which have recently been solved. In addition, I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1982 murder of Herman Gilbert. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So I also need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. When I started this podcast nearly 6 years ago, I thought it would be cool if maybe 1 or 2 of the cold cases I covered might get solved someday, but I never envisioned that so many of these cases would be solved that I'd have enough material for not just 1, but 2 update episodes. But this goes to show you how much cold case investigations have evolved these past 6 years, and what a godsend that DNA and genetic genealogy have been. I have no doubt that even more of the cold cases which I have covered on The Trail Went Cold are going to be solved, and if all goes well, I might be returning again before too long to complete an entire trilogy with a third update episode. So I want to wish everyone a happy new year, and here's hoping that more cold cases get solved in 2022. Have yourself a great week and join us next Wednesday as we return to our regular format and present a brand new episode about another unsolved mystery on the trail when cold.